Hello, I'm Ivy. In this chapter, we will explore another intriguing mystery surrounding Skinwalker Ranch.
Decades of high-tech surveillance, million-dollar scientific investigations, and countless eyewitness accounts have failed to pin down the elusive phenomena of Skinwalker Ranch. Yet, standing in stark opposition to the investigators, researchers, and believers are the skeptics who argue that the most terrifying monster in the valley is not a shape-shifting entity or an interdimensional traveler, but the human mind itself. When investigators from the National Institute for Discovery Science set up cameras and monitoring stations in the late 1990s, they expected to capture verifiable physical proof. Instead, critics suggest they captured something far more ordinary, yet profoundly misunderstood: a cascade of mass hysteria, psychological suggestion, and environmental misinterpretation, amplified by the powerful machinery of modern media. Examining the skeptical file requires stripping away the cinematic drama and looking directly at the mechanics of fear in isolation. The Uintah Basin is a landscape defined by vast emptiness, extreme isolation, and an environment that can easily play tricks on human perception. Psychologists have long documented how sensory deprivation in remote wilderness areas can induce auditory and visual pareidolia, where the brain frantically tries to make sense of ambiguous stimuli by manufacturing familiar shapes, shadows, or sounds. When a rancher or researcher hears an unexplained groan in the dark or catches a fleeting glimpse of a distorted shadow across a ridge, the brain's baseline assumption in a preconditioned environment is immediately skewed toward the paranormal. Critics of the Skinwalker legend point out that the entire narrative was heavily supercharged by commercial interests, sensationalized reporting, and the human desire for a compelling mystery. Before the property was purchased by aerospace billionaire Robert Bigelow, local folklore existed primarily as traditional regional storytelling, deeply rooted in cultural history, but largely confined within local oral traditions. Once modern media, best-selling books, and internet forums seized upon the narrative, a feedback loop was established. People visited or lived near the area already armed with the expectation of terror, meaning every strange animal behavior, every distant headlight, and every unusual atmospheric phenomenon was automatically filtered through the lens of the paranormal. The investigation itself has faced rigorous scrutiny from the scientific community for lacking the strict controls required for empirical validation. Much of the evidence gathered at the ranch relies heavily on anecdotal testimony, subjective eyewitness accounts, and data points that cannot be independently replicated in laboratory settings. Skeptics argue that relying on personal anecdotes in an environment saturated with expectation is a recipe for false positives. When researchers are actively looking for the extraordinary, ordinary occurrences such as misidentified wildlife, nocturnal predators like coyotes or badgers with mange, atmospheric dust devils, or military flares from nearby testing ranges can easily be elevated to the status of unexplained anomalies. Consider the infamous reports of glowing orbs and bizarre aerial lights dancing across the night sky above the basin. While witnesses describe intelligent craft performing physics-defying maneuvers, aerospace analysts and debunkers note that the region sits beneath active military airspace. The proximity to testing grounds, high-altitude training corridors, and experimental aircraft flights provides a rational, mundane explanation for many documented sightings. Yet, when filtered through the psychological predisposition of observers desperate to witness something supernatural, a routine military exercise transforms into an otherworldly visitation. Furthermore, the psychological phenomenon known as social contagion plays a massive role in how groups process fear and ambiguity. When one respected member of a research team or a prominent landowner reports an unsettling encounter, the psychological threshold for others in the group shifts dramatically. Suddenly, minor anomalies are shared, discussed, amplified, and cemented into the collective memory as undeniable proof. The human brain is a social organ, wired to conform to group narratives, especially in high-stress, high-stakes environments where danger is perceived to be lurking just beyond the campfire light. Yet, dismissing every single report as mere imagination or media hype creates its own intellectual contradiction. While psychology and skepticism account for a vast percentage of the phenomena, investigators who spent years on the ground maintain that certain occurrences defied conventional rationalization. They reported physical trace evidence, electronic instrument failures that coincided with anomalous readings, and multiple.
The psychological burden carried by those who investigated Skinwalker Ranch remains one of the most compelling aspects of the entire dossier. Former researchers have openly spoken about the lingering anxiety, paranoia, and deep-seated unease that followed them long after their contracts ended and the monitoring equipment was packed away. Critics argue that this emotional fallout is merely the result of sleep deprivation, prolonged stress in harsh field conditions, and the intense pressure of trying to validate an unfalsifiable hypothesis. However, those who lived through the experience insisted that the psychological weight felt external, invasive, and fundamentally unnatural, defying simple clinical definitions of operational stress. This brings the investigation to the central paradox of the entire Skinwalker enigma, the weaponization of belief. Whether the anomalous events documented on the ranch were physical entities, psychological projections, or a complex interplay of both, their ultimate power relied entirely on how the human observer interacted with them. Folklore has long taught that certain mysteries grow stronger the more attention, fear, and belief they are fed. In this sense, the intense media scrutiny and scientific obsession of the late 20th and early 21st centuries may have acted as a modern catalyst, supercharging a localized legend into a modern cultural phenomenon. To understand how a regional tale transformed into a modern mythology, one must look at the way contemporary culture consumes the unknown. In an era dominated by hyperconnectivity and secular skepticism, modern society retains a deep, almost primal hunger for genuine mystery. When rational science fails to provide a neat, comforting explanation for every corner of the natural world, spaces like Skinwalker Ranch become blank canvases onto which humanity projects its deepest existential anxieties. The monster in the dark is no longer just a local superstition. It becomes a symbol of the limits of human knowledge and the terrifying realization that there are still realms beyond our control. Yet, reducing the phenomenon to a mere cultural construct risks ignoring the stubborn persistence of the physical reports that inspired the investigation in the first place. Long before television crews, internet forums, and billionaire-funded research institutes arrived in the Uinta Basin, indigenous communities maintained strict taboos regarding the land, warning outsiders that certain boundaries should never be crossed. These traditional warnings were not framed as invitations to scientific inquiry or entertainment. They were rules for survival, passed down through generations to protect people from forces deemed too volatile to understand or provoke. When modern investigators ignored these cultural boundaries in pursuit of empirical data, they effectively stepped into a narrative that had been unfolding long before the birth of modern technology. Skeptics may view the indigenous folklore as primitive superstition meant to explain natural phenomena, but cultural historians emphasize that dismissing native traditions as mere ignorance blinds modern science to centuries of accumulated environmental wisdom. The land remembers what science often forgets, that certain places possess a distinct psychological and cultural gravity that commands profound respect. As the decades have passed, the narrative surrounding SKINWALKER Ranch has evolved from a localized secret into a cornerstone of contemporary paranormal pop culture, inspiring countless documentaries, podcasts, and independent investigations. This commercialization has undoubtedly muddied the waters, introducing fabrication, exaggeration, and internet folklore that obscures whatever kernel of genuine mystery originally existed. For every serious researcher attempting to analyze environmental anomalies, there are dozens of opportunistic hoaxers seeking to capitalize on the public's insatiable appetite for the uncanny, making objective truth nearly impossible to isolate. And yet, despite the commercial noise, the skepticism, and the rational explanations that account for 99% of what occurs in the valley, a lingering residue of the unexplicable remains. It is found in the quiet testimonies of locals who refuse to discuss what they saw after dark, in the anomalous data points that baffled engineers who had no stake in folklore, and in the persistent unease that settles over anyone who spends a silent night staring out across the empty expanse of the basin. The mystery survives not because it has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, but because it resists absolute categorization. The journey through the archives of SKINWALKER Ranch ultimately reveals less about monsters in the dark and much more about the nature of human curiosity itself. Humanity is a species driven by an unyielding need to map the unknown, to shine a light into every shadowed corner, and to name every terror that lurks beyond the perimeter of the campfire. When faced with a mystery that refuses to be solved, the human mind is forced to confront its own limitations, realizing that understanding the universe requires accepting that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Whether the phenomena are driven by unknown forces of nature, psychological contagion, or something entirely beyond human comprehension, the legend of the valley continues to endure as a monument to the unexplained. The cameras have been turned off, the monitoring stations have shifted, but out in the vast, silent reaches of the desert, the valley keeps its own counsel, waiting quietly for the next generation of seekers to test its boundaries. Standing at the edge of the archive, the listener is left suspended between two irreconcilable worlds, the cold comfort and certainty of rational skepticism, and the lingering, unsettling whisper of the unknown. There are no neat conclusions to be drawn, no final scientific papers that neatly tie up every loose end, and no definitive answers waiting at the bottom of the file. There is only the landscape, the wind moving across the dry earth, and the persistent, haunting reminder that some questions are never meant to be answered.